So throughout Jesus' ministry in this earth, he did lots of wonderful things. He performed a lot of powerful miracles. He healed a lot of people in incredible ways. And perhaps most importantly, during his ministry, Jesus taught us things. He gave us teachings that revolutionized the way that we understood God, the way that we understood his word, and the way that we understood the way that we are supposed to live. And in Jesus' ministry, of all the things that he taught, probably his most famous sermon that he preached was the Sermon on the Mount, where a great multitude came up on a mountain to hear him teach, and he stood before them and he just started teaching. And this begins in Matthew chapter 5, and it extends for a few chapters after that. You know, we get some of the most important teachings from the Lord in the Sermon on the Mount. That's where we get the Lord's Prayer from, for instance. And there's so much in this that we could spend an entire year in church just looking at things that Jesus taught us in the Sermon on the Mount. But at the very beginning of this big, long sermon, where he's going to cover some of the most important teachings the Lord ever gave us, he starts by calling out all of these different groups of people and blessing them. And we call these the Beatitudes. He calls out 8 different groups of people, and he says, "Blessed are they." And so over the next 8 weeks, we are going to look at all 8 of these groups and look at why Jesus would have chosen to begin his most famous sermon by calling out to these specific groups and giving them blessings. And this week, we are focusing on the first of those groups, which is the poor in spirit. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And so when thinking about the poor in spirit, I want to turn now to the Lord's Word and read a parable that Jesus taught that comes later on in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 18. And in this parable, it's about 2 men who come to pray in the temple, and one of them is someone who I would consider to be poor in spirit, and the other is someone who isn't. So as we listen, I invite us to pay attention to what are the differences that we notice between these 2 men who come to pray in the temple. Also, he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed this way with himself: "God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess." And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but he would beat his breast, saying, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, there's a lot packed into this short little story. But in the story, these 2 men come to pray in the temple, and one of them is a Pharisee, and the other one is a tax collector. Now, what do those mean? The man who's a Pharisee, the Pharisees were the religious leaders at that time. These were the people whose job it was to study the Word, to study all of the rules that God had given them and the ways that God had told them they were supposed to live, and teach that to other people and help make sure that everyone was following the rules that God had given them. In the eyes of the people at the time, this would have been the good guy. He was here. He works for the church. He studies the Word. And so he comes to the temple to pray. But the other person is a tax collector. And tax collectors, sometimes the tax collectors weren't even Israelites. They weren't even a part of the same religion as everyone else. Or sometimes they were. But people felt like their loyalty was split because they worked for the Roman government, and their job was to collect money for the Romans. And tax collectors at that time had a reputation for not being very honest. They would do things like they'd go up to someone and say, well, this person owes $10 to the government, but I'm going to tell them that they owe 15, and I'll pay the 10 to the government, and I'm going to keep that 5 and keep it for myself. So tax collectors were looked at as people who lied, people who stole, people who worked for the government. These were bad guys, people who we don't like. And so on paper, these two men come into the temple. One should be a good guy. He's a guy who works for the church, who studies the word and teaches people what the word says. And the other one is a tax collector who works for the Romans, and he takes money from all of us, and he might lie or he might steal. But they pray very differently. The Pharisee, the good guy, he comes in and he stands tall, and I like to imagine him with his head held high and his arms out, and he says, God, thank you that I am not like these other men, these unjust, these sinners, these adulterers, or even like this tax collector. And he says, I give tithes of all that I possess. I fast twice a week. And he thanks the Lord that he's not like all of these other bad people around him. While the tax collector, he's standing a distance off, and he can't even raise his eyes to heaven. He can't even look the Lord in the face. And it says, as he's looking down, he beats his chest, and he says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And so we can look at this from the outside, and we can say, look at this guy. He can't even look the Lord in the eye. And here he is admitting that he's a sinner, that he's done all of this bad stuff. See, what a bad guy he is. While the Pharisee, look, he works for the church. He studies the word. He teaches us what God wants from all of us. Shouldn't he be able to be proud of all the good things he's done? And yet Jesus says that it was the tax collector who went away justified after the way that he prayed in the temple, and not the Pharisee. Why would that be? Why would it be that the way that the Pharisee prayed wasn't effective, that it didn't work? Why was it that the tax collector, the guy who's supposed to be the bad guy, who can't even look the Lord in the eyes, why was his prayer the one that justified him? Well, for this, I want to turn to the teachings of the new church and read a passage from the work, The Doctrine of Life. And it talks about the difference between when we do good from ourselves versus when we do good from the Lord. It says, we cannot do genuine good from ourselves. These days, hardly any of us know whether the good we do is from ourselves or from God. This is because the church has separated faith from charity, and good is related to charity. We can give to the poor, help the needy, donate to churches and hospitals, promote the well-being of the church, our country, and our fellow citizens, regularly attend places of worship, devoutly listen and pray, read the Word and other religious books, and think about salvation, but still not know whether we are doing those things from ourselves or from God. If we do these things from God, then they are good. But if we do them solely from ourselves, then they are not good. There are externally good deeds which we can do from ourselves that internally are obviously evil, like hypocritical good deeds which are meant to deceive people. So this passage is saying that we can do good things for different reasons. We can do good things from ourselves, or we can do these things from the Lord. And I think that this is the difference that we see between the Pharisee and the tax collector here. The Pharisee was able to list off good things that he had done, but notice the tone that he took. He started his prayer by thanking the Lord, but what did he thank him for? He didn't thank the Lord for helping him be a good person. He didn't thank the Lord for leading him and guiding him. He was thanking the Lord for the fact that he was better than other people. And this, I think, is the ticket. That if we believe that the good things that we do make us better than other people, then we are doing them from ourselves and not from the Lord. Because the Lord calls us to love him and to love our neighbors above all else. And so if we are doing genuine good, then we would be doing it for the love of other people, not because of the glory that we get from it. And so when the Pharisee stood and prayed, and he showed how proud he was, when he was able to stand tall and talk about how he wasn't like all of these other horrible, evil people around him, it showed that really all he was concerned about was himself. Meanwhile, the tax collector, the bad guy at that time, he can't even look the Lord in the eyes because he knows that he has sinned. And this is the big difference. When we approach the Lord with humility, like the tax collector, when we recognize that we aren't better than other people because of the way that we live, that is how we realize that we need the Lord in our lives. Because if we believe that we're justified, if we believe that the way that we've lived makes us good, better people than other people, then we don't feel that we need the Lord, because we can do good all on our own, and we know exactly what we need to do. But when we look at ourselves and we recognize, yeah, I still have a lot more of growing that I need to do. I still have areas that I need to work on. That's what brings us to the mindset that shows us that we need the Lord. And so this is why the Lord calls out before anyone else. He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He's teaching us that we need to approach the Lord with humility, to not allow our good deeds to go to our head and make us feel better than other people because of the way that we're living, but instead focus on doing good from the Lord, which is doing good for the sake of loving other people and helping and supporting them. And so this is our spiritual task as we go into this next week. There's two parts to it. I want us to practice being the poor in spirit this week. And the first part of how we can do that is through prayer. That we can pray like the tax collector. Take some time this week and talk to the Lord. But let's try to focus on how can we talk to the Lord from a place of humility. How can we talk to the Lord from a place that shows that we know that we need him, that we need his teachings and his guidance and his love to lead us. And the second part is that we can focus on doing good this week. But when we do it, when we have an opportunity to do something to help someone, I would invite us to think, how can I do this not from myself, but from the Lord? How can I let go of my need to take credit for this thing that I'm doing and instead just focus on the use that I get to serve by doing something kind for someone else? And if we do these things, if we speak to the Lord from humility, and if we focus on doing good, not from ourselves, but from the Lord, then we can be like the poor in spirit. And that is how we enter the kingdom of heaven. Amen. Let's rise for benediction. Sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Before we come forward to partake in the sacrament of the Holy Supper, I wanted to talk a little bit more about our subject for this morning, which is the first of the Beatitudes. And as we get ready to embark on this journey of looking at all of the Beatitudes one at a time over the next 8 weeks, I thought it'd be useful for me to take a moment and read all of the Beatitudes to everyone. And so I'd like to do that here. And as I read these, I would invite us to reflect on, notice what kinds of people the Lord chooses to call out here. Remember, this is the very beginning of his Sermon on the Mount. This is how he has chosen to start his most famous body of teaching by calling out these groups. So I want us to notice who he calls out. And I would also invite us to reflect a little bit on which of these groups do we feel we identify with the most. This is the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. And seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when they revile and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So what do we notice about these groups that the Lord has decided to call out and give these special blessings to? I think for me, the biggest thing that stands out is that he's not talking about the powerful groups. He's not talking about the big popular crowds. Really, the people who Jesus is calling out are the people who are sort of on the lower end of society. He's talking about the poor in spirit, the meek, the people who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the people who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And this is a theme that I think we're going to keep coming back to over these next 8 weeks, is looking at the fact that the Lord called out these groups of people. He doesn't say, blessed are the powerful. He doesn't say, blessed are the religious leaders, because great is their wisdom. He's talking about the people who are sort of on the lower end of society, and he's calling them out and giving them blessings. And I think there's an overall message for us in this, that when the Lord is calling us to himself, when he's calling us forward in our spiritual lives, he's not calling us to be better than other people. He's not calling for us to do great, amazing things. But really, what he's calling all of us to do is to approach him with humility. You know, one of the teachings in the new church is that humility is essential for our worship. It calls it essential. It says that we can't genuinely worship the Lord unless we are able to do so out of humility. Because again, if we don't have humility, then we won't see the areas where we need to grow. We won't see the areas where we need the Lord in our lives. And so with this in mind, I'd like to turn to the teachings of the new church and share one last passage that talks about the power of humility and submission when it comes to our relationship to the Lord. This is from the work Arcana Celestia, number 4347. When it comes to the expression of humility and submission, few know why these are necessary in the presence of the divine when a person is engaged in worship. Nor, consequently, do they know what is accomplished by these actions. Those who have no knowledge of interior things cannot do other than believe that, like any human being bent on glory, the divine desires people's expression of humility and their submission to him, and that therefore the divine desires glory from them and is affected by the glory which people ascribe to him. But the truth of the matter is altogether different from this. The divine is not moved by any desire for glory. Indeed, what glory does the divine have which comes from man? He desires humility and submission, not for his own sake, but for man's. For when humility is present in a person, he turns away from the evil and falsity present in him, and in so doing removes them. Once these have been removed, the divine is able to flow in with good and truth. Anyone can recognize this within himself. One who is conceited is ruled by self-love, and not only sets himself up above others, but also does not care a thing about what is divine. As a consequence, he turns back the influx of good, and therefore prevents it from being joined to truths. This is the real reason why a person should express humility in the presence of the divine. So this passage is saying that if we only think of God in terms of human qualities just like us, then we can get an idea of him that makes him feel almost selfish, right? Why would the Lord need all of us to worship him? Why would he tell us that we have to have humility when we go before him? Why would he tell us that we have to submit to his guidance? If a human being told us all of those things, we would say that they were totally self-centered. But it says that the reason the Lord asks these things of us isn't for his own sake. He doesn't want these things because he wants glory from all of us, or he wants to feel better than the human race, or to put us in our place. But he asks humility and submission from us, not for his sake, but for ours. Because again, like I've said a couple times this morning, if we don't have humility, then we won't see a reason why we need the Lord. Without humility, we can fall into the trap of thinking that we can do good all by ourselves, that we have earned the goodness that we have, that it makes us better than other people. And it was interesting that it mentioned that in this passage too. It talked about people who feel like they're better than other people, which is exactly what the Pharisee was doing when he was praying in the temple. So again, humility is an essential part of how we worship the Lord. And this is why he chose to begin the Beatitudes, which he chose to begin his entire greatest body of teaching by calling out the poor in spirit. Because he's not telling us that we have to be lowly. He's not telling us that we have to feel like we're nothing and be that kind of poor in spirit. But he's telling us that we have to recognize that we still have room to grow, and that for the entire duration of our lives, we are here to work with the Lord, to seek his guidance and his help as we try to let go of the parts of us that are holding us back from a close relationship with him, to let go of the things that are holding us back from genuinely loving our neighbors, from having healthy relationships with God and with his word and with each other. And so this morning, in a moment, we are going to move into the Holy Supper portion of our service. And I would invite all of us to approach the Holy Supper this morning, and as we do so, reflect on the power of approaching the Lord from a place of humility. You know, taking the sacrament doesn't make us better than other people. It's not this external act that's here just to make us feel good about ourselves. But it's an opportunity to approach the Lord, to invite him into our hearts and into our minds, and to remind ourselves that we need the Lord in our lives. We need him to guide us. We need him to support us and uphold us and uplift us. Because with God, all things are possible. Amen. Let us now move into the Holy Supper portion of our